Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Fund information. And if you look down, the second one that down from Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Fund information, that's the SLFRF Compliance Reporting Guidance. Click that one. These are the categories that were updated, okay? So if you're going to do a project, one of the things that I tell everybody that we've been trying to educate on the Fiscal Recovery Fund funding is that if you're going to do a proposal, it has to fit into one of these categories. And I believe that the amendment that was made in Twin Arrows is going to have this as an attachment. But what it does is it limits which items that you can. Unfortunately, that committee report still hasn't been completed, so I can't reference the exhibits that are going to be on there. But in the draft amendment, that I believe was one of them. But these are the categories that are available. If you're going to propose projects, again, they need to fit into one of these. The other part is if you're going to do proposals, you have to do a proposal for each category. You can't put a proposal together. Say section 3 on the listing. If you do one for 3.1, public sector workforce payroll, that has to be one proposal. If you do one for 3.2, public sector workforce rehiring public sector staff, that has to be a separate proposal. The reason being is that when you get to the reporting process to the funding source, which is the United States government, all of the expenses have to be by category. So if you have 24 regions, then you can probably group them together, but that would really be a determination that Department of Justice would need to make. So become familiar with these. So each proposal that you do has to fit into one of these categories. If it doesn't, then DOJ is going to say that it's not eligible. So first thing, it has to fit in the category. The other one that you should be aware of is that these funds are not general fund money. They're not citizen. They're not UUFB. Those are pretty unrestricted on how you use those funds. These ones have to tie into those. Now, if you go back to the previous page, back to the home page, go back there. So now I've let you know which categories are done. Now go back to the Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Fund information. Scroll down towards the bottom, and that last one that says ARPA NNFRF process flow chart for review and approval. Click that one. Okay, the first one says Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Fund New Projects Eligibility Review as per BFS-31-21. So the first step, if you go, it goes from left to right. So you need to attach an Appendix A. That Appendix A, I'll show you what goes next. That request has to go to DOJ. Now, chapters underneath BFS-31-21 can't submit directly to DOJ. Those forms are underneath that BFS-3121, and I'll take you there in a little bit. As far as I can see from the forms, community development has to be the one to sign those forms. Because they're listed underneath the forms that were adopted by Budget and Finance Committee sets it up that way. So you have to submit your proposals to community development. They sign it, and then they're the ones that submit it to DOJ. So once it gets to them, they'll review it, sign off on the form, which is the Appendix A, submit it to DOJ on behalf of the chapter. Then DOJ makes their determination, and then DOJ responds back to community development, and that goes back over to the chapters. So that process is there. And then when you get to the eligibility portion of it, that square that's kind of turned to the side, then that's where you go either get a yes or a no. If it's a yes, then you go into the legislative process. So if you scroll down on that page, it'll say Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery of New Projects Legislation as per CJY 41-21. So when you get your list together through the eligibility determination, then you got to sponsor a legislation. And a delegate has to sponsor that legislation, goes to Office of Legislative Counsel, then they prepare legislation, and then the legislation is passed, yes or no. Once the say you get it through the whole process, you get 16 in favor votes, then it goes to the president, and the president has, he can sign it into law, veto it, or line item veto it. If you line item veto it, then that project is pretty much done. So go back to the home page for the FRF website. Once you go back there, if you're going, or when you do your proposals, a couple of things that you should know. Go back to the top icons and go on ahead and go to the resolutions. When you go to resolutions, the first one you'll see is that, see where it says downloads, BFS 3121. If you go down to Exhibit 2, this is the non-certified chapters. So click that one. If you're a non-certified chapter, this is the form that you'll use, which is Exhibit 2. Scroll down a little bit, and those are the instructions. And towards the end, we worked with one of the staff from OPVP office, and they made it a PDF fillable form. This is the one that you need to fill out if you're a non-certified chapter. So it has information on certified chapter requesting FRF, the date prepared, chapter's mailing address. This form was prepared by so-and-so. It asks us for your chapter president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, chapter manager, CSC, and who the DCD chapter ASO is, and the type of subcontractors that will be used. That's part one. Part two, explain your project, and then you attach justifications, support documentation for it. Explain how the program or project will benefit the Navajo Nation, Navajo communities, or the Navajo people. So that's page 1 of 2. The next page you need to do is projects or to be completed by December 31, 2026. Identify who will be responsible for implementing the program or project. Explain who will be responsible for operations and maintenance costs once the projects are completed, and how such costs will be funded prospectively. And then under F is state which of the 66. So that 66 is actually an old number. I believe there's more categories. So when I showed you the categories of eligible projects, you need to list one of those and indicate which category it is, and the listing of the expenditures program or programs fall under this, and explain why. Why are you putting it under that category? Then if there's additional documents, you submit. Now, here is the part where you put in part 4 is the affirmation by funding recipient. So whoever prepared it from the chapter has to sign it on the left-hand side. Then the chapter president signs, chapter president or vice president signs on the right-hand side. The signature, the CSC signs it, and then approved by the chapter ASO. So if you look down below it, you have on page 2 of 2 that approved to submit for review. See, that's where it says signature of DCD director. In the other forms that are there, it says a director. But in this case, when Budget and Finance approve it, when it comes to a chapter, it made it very specific that it has to be the CDC director. And attached to that is the old 66 category. So that one has been updated, so use the new one. And then you attach the budget form 1, and then you attach the budget revision form is just there for reference. So that's for a non-certified chapter. Now again, go to resolutions, BFS 31-21, that Exhibit 3. This is for the certified chapters. So click that one, scroll down, and basically the information is the same. So, but the forms you have to use are the ones that are part of the exhibits for BFS 3121. And again, when you get to the bottom of the signature, is whoever prepared it has to sign it, then it has to be approved by the chapter president or vice president, then it has to be signed by the chapter manager or CSC, and then it has to be approved by the DCD chapter ASO, and then again, it specifically asks for the signature of the DCD director. And again, the chart is there, but you need to use the new one, all right? So you go back to that one. Now, when I've seen some of these reviews come through, what I would concentrate on, and when DOJ reviews it, click on CJY 41-21 underneath resolutions. So that should bring up CJY 4121. Now scroll down on after the August 2nd letter, page 1, page 2, page 3. Underneath CJY 4121, page 3 of 13, underneath that I, this is the criteria that you should write your proposals for. The first one is respond to the COVID-19 public health emergency and its negative economic impacts, including assistance to households, small businesses, nonprofits, and so on. Number 2 is respond to workers performing essential work. 3 is provide government services to the extent of the reduction in Navajo Nation revenue. 4 is make necessary investment in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So you need to pick one of those and then elaborate on that. So on the other form, when you say, why are you doing this, that's the guidance that you should use. When I've seen documents that were up for review by DOJ, what they'll say is, you need to justify it more so that it aligns with one of these. If you do a good job on it the first time, more than likely you'll get it approved if it is an eligible project. So remember, each category has to have its own proposal, and then each one of those, the forms that are attached to it have to be signed by the people that are on that form. And then the third part of it is when you write it, you need to make sure that you try to comply with page 3 of 13 under CJY 41-21 underneath I. The 4 categories are right there. So if you want to take a look at what actually set the parameters for it underneath the website, that's CJ 4121. You can read through all of that. If you want to read about the $557 million that was allocated for hardship, that's CD 62-21. If you want to take a look at what was in the original legislation for 257, that's underneath legislation summary sheet tracking number 0257-21, that's available there. Now, the Delegate Crotty earlier mentioned that there's that if you want to take a look at what was underneath the original booklet, go on ahead and hit link, scroll down underneath Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Fund, and then go to, this says Nabikia, section 1, section 2, all the way down to 8, 9, 10, and then the last one underneath there after section 10. If you click that one, that is actually the whole booklet that was provided to council. It's broken down by sections, and it's broken down by the whole book. And I believe, hold on, how is it you do a search? This is a searchable PDF file. So if you want to search, say, your chapter projects, you do Control FN, and then you can type in, say, Shiprock. So when you type in Shiprock, it's not working. The file is supposed to actually be searchable, but we'll double check with our crew and make sure that it's updated. It was searchable before. So we'll update that file again. So if you want to take a look at any of the projects that are already there, they're broken down by sections again, and then the full file is there. Okay? I believe that's everything that we have as far as the fiscal recovery process for project review. Are there any questions?
Good afternoon, everyone. You would just need to press *6 to ask any questions. Before we go to questions, Mr. Platero, I do see we have more callers that have joined us. Shinantai, if there are any other honorable delegates on the line, can you go ahead and please introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. This is Delegate Paul Begay from Western Agency. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Delegate Rick Nez on the call.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Delegate Nez and Delegate Begay for joining us. Is there anyone else that has joined that would like to introduce themselves for the record?
Good afternoon, Deja Sherlyn Yazdi from the Office of the Speakers on the line.
Thank you, Chief of Staff Yazdi, for joining the call this afternoon. Is anyone else on the line who has not introduced themselves? And again, you just need to press *6 to unmute. Okay, thank you everyone for joining the call.
Melinda, can I add a little bit?
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Platero.
The way that I remember that the amendment that was passed at Twin Arrows, it was worded in a way that will facilitate the process. So once the signature is made with Dr. Yellowman, we're more than happy to assist with transferring that information over to DOJ for the eligibility determination. They usually email and copy me on it after the determinations are made, and we'll help facilitate that process. So like I said, we're here to help. We want to make sure that things get done as quickly as possible. And if you have any questions, our contact information is on the website. You can contact any of us, and we're all willing to work together to get this completed as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Platero. This is Melinda. We do have some questions coming in. I know that you had just covered it in the step-by-step process. If you can repeat the website link once again for our callers, and again, everyone, just to state for the record that this call is also being live streamed on Facebook and on YouTube. So on that end, Mr. Platero.
www.frf.navajo-nsn.gov. And Melinda, just so you're aware, what I'll do is I'll go on ahead and the attachments that I sent to the delegates that were on the agenda, I'll go on ahead and send that to all 24 of the delegates so that they can see that information. And again, if you have any questions, we're here to help. We'll do the best that we can to facilitate this process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Platero, for your presentation overview. In following the process for project reviews, do we have any questions for Mr. Platero before we move on to Division of Community Development?
I have a question. This is Walter Haas from NTUA.
Go ahead, Mr. Haas.
Thank you. Hey, Tom, you described the process for how a project gets approved and potentially gets funded. Then I'm assuming the next step in the process would end up having to be the sub-grant recipient process. Are you going to describe what that is, or would that process go directly to the vendor that's chosen by the chapter, or how do you foresee that going forward?
At this point, our office has only dealt with subrecipients with tribal programs and with NTUA. Those were set up through the CARES-D funded project. So all of those were already pre-set up. We haven't ventured into outside of a tribal enterprise or outside of a tribal department. That will be discovered as we go along this process. It all depends on who they list as the ones that are going to actually do the project and who's going to be the administrative oversight for it. Our office is going to, no matter who you designate as this is the entity that's going to overlook the project, basically oversight, we're going to end up from the NNFRF office reviewing and monitoring all of the FRF projects, and that includes the administrative regulatory programs that were funded. That includes the CARES-D funded. That will also include all of the approved expenditure plans. The one that I don't really see us having to go in and monitor is going to be the CISN and UUFB, because those were already closed out, and that's just a transaction to move the expenses from the previous account into the ARPA accounts.
Okay, so I have another question for you. Obviously, prices and costs are going to change dynamically over time. So are you going to be telling the chapters to make sure that they've put in enough of a cushion or enough of a basically a capital oversight, so that they're going to actually not be responsible for the balance of plant funding? So what I mean by that is, when you had agreements with N2A, if we said the project was going to cost $1 million and it cost $1,050,000, we were the organization that had to put up the additional $50,000 to get the project built. With the chapters and the delegates now part of that process, I'm wondering exactly how that and who would be responsible for that balance of plant or that funding that comes in over what the request is for.
Mr. Platero, are you still on the call?
Linda?
Yes, go ahead. We can hear you.
Okay, I got disconnected and I just called back in. I'm not sure what happened after I responded to Mr. Haas. I apologize.
Mr. Haas, can you go ahead and repeat the question?
Sure. Tom, what I was asking is, as an example, with the programs that are currently out there, if N2A got a project approved for the process and it cost $1 million for the project in the estimate, but it cost us $1,050,000 to build it because of increased costs and things like that, N2A is the obligated party to come up with the extra dollars. How will that work regarding a chapter? Because I'm sure, or what guidance do you give to the chapters to try to avoid that happening?
The best answer that I can give you is we need to get the actual project implementation stage. We haven't done that, so we haven't actually had to address any of those concerns. Like I said, the only ones that we have up to this point, if a chapter wants to fund, the way I'm understanding it, and again, legal should really be answering some of these questions because they're very protective of the responses, but just from a common sense standpoint, if the chapter wants to do projects that were in the booklet and NTUA is going to be the lead for it, they can designate NTUA as that. But what's going to happen is each fund management plan that's put up in there, if they designate NTUA to do that project, then each one of those is going to require one a contract for, or one subrecipient agreement contract for each one of those. So instead of just doing one where we did all the NTUA projects, under one agreement, similar to how we did the CARES defunded, we would need to do one contract for each expenditure plan that designates it, because you're going to be breaking them up into the 24. So rather than just one umbrella one, we would need to do one for each expenditure plan, because each one of those would have a K account. Melinda?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Platero, for your response. We are, as I mentioned, getting questions about chapter projects. I'm not sure if this is a question for Mr. Platero or Dr. Yellowman. We haven't got to the Division of Community Development's presentation yet. However, just in terms of project review or the process through the FRF office, at this point, Mr. Platero, the question was, how do chapters know if their project was submitted to Division of Community Development's portal? And then how those projects, or how do the chapters then know that those projects were submitted to DOJ? So I believe this is a project review question for Mr. Platero.
Melinda, the way I'm understanding it is the report that's coming out from Legislative Council and Legislative Services, one of the exhibits that will be attached are projects that have already been reviewed by NNDOJ. I believe that's the process that's going in there. Like I said, we're all waiting for that report to come out to see what's in it, because it basically, when Navigator passed it, normally the process is that those exhibits are already there, but in this case they passed it with a language at the end as a catch-all to say that those exhibits will be attached. And I believe the emails going back and forth, they're still putting all those together. So nothing can be, we can't comment on what the process is going to be or the exhibits to the amendment to the legislation until that committee report comes out. So there's a lot of what-if scenarios at this moment until that committee report is generated.
Melinda, this is Delegate Crotty. So, Mr. Platero, I understand that you're trying to answer the questions with your understanding of the amendment. If you could answer the question with the original, in its original form, the legislation as it stands, when it was dropped back in November, where do chapters go to see if their projects that they submitted to the DCD portal were vetted?
Delegate Crotty, I provided that to the council, I believe back in December was the last time that we got it. I was cautioned by Department of Justice not to be making that public until I get an authorization from them. I did get authorization when we were at Twin Arrows at a meeting, and there is one that's floating around that's going back and forth, but I would need to go back to DOJ to get their approval to release that list.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Platero. That's very critical to this conversation, as some background, the chapters were under the impression that all of their projects were vetted, and so we would need the support from the office and the different entities to inform chapters what projects are vetted, and so we could move forward developing the list of projects that was submitted into the portal for the eligibility. So thank you, Mr. Platero. Could you let me know in terms of a timeline when that will be made available for the chapters? Thank you.
I believe there, from the emails that have been going back and forth, there is an updated list as of this morning, and I believe that's the one that's going to be attached to the committee report.
Thank you, Delegate Crotty and Mr. Platero, for your response. We do have another request for questions. Delegate Chairman Nez?
Thank you. Thank you for this teleconference meeting. Since NTUA is on the call, I would like to just ask this question to NTUA. So most of my funding for electricity, this funding is supposed to be for our people receiving electricity and other pertinent projects such as water, bathroom additions and such. But with the electricity part, a lot of my money that was allocated to my district is going to NTUA's upgrades and replacements. And I just thought that NTUA had its own operation and maintenance funds for those purposes. These monies were supposed to be for our people to have electricity so people could have refrigerators and store their medicines in these refrigerators. But some people don't have electricity, so they can't have they can't have refrigerators. So my question is why a lot of this money is going towards NTUA for replacements and upgrades? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Nez. Mr. Haas?
Sure, I'd be glad to answer that question. Thank you for asking that question, Chairman Nez. The piece that's on the APRA legislation is not for replacement or upgrades. It's actually for capacity projects. That is electrical line capacity upgrades so that we have the capacity to connect the additional customers. And so we have the capacity to connect up the water project and the wastewater projects and the broadband projects. So it's not for an upgrade, it is for a capacity. So as we extend out, basically in the proposed original legislation, there was connections for almost 4,000 electric connections to the electric grid. Those electrical connections required new lines to be built and added capacity so that those customers could be powered up. That's what those capacity upgrades are for. It's for strengthening a line, building up the line so it can connect those additional residential customers, also to connect up the water lines, the wastewater plants, the water treatment plants, and the broadband customers. All those people require additional electricity, and the lines that are currently in place do not have the capacity to add on those customers without having to be rebuilt or extended or have new substations built in. So that's what the section under the original electric request was for. It was for capacity enhancements and capacity upgrades so we can handle the new loads that are generated by the new customers. Under the proposed legislation change that is out there right now, there are no connections to homes and there are no capacity upgrades. There's no water or anything else. The chapters will have to build those costs into the projects as they request those projects being brought online. So that'll have to be re-engineered and re-looked at depending on the requests from each one of the chapters.
Thank you, Mr. Haas, for your response. Chairman Nez, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Ms. Siako. Mr. Haas, when you say the chapters will have to pay for those, either way, the chapter is going to pay for it and not NTUA. You're not answering my question as far as operation and maintenance that you guys have. You should be able, as an enterprise, you call yourself a service provider, and yet you don't want to pay for this. This money is supposed to go to the people that do not have electricity. That's what I'm concerned about. This is why I voted in favor of this amendment to Honorable Crotty's, is when I saw that NTOA, from my funding for my chapters, the majority of the funding was for your purpose, for NTOA's purpose, to upgrade their system, to replace their system. I understand what you're saying. Either way, whether the chapter pays for it, are you saying that they're still going to pay for your system when you should be having those funding available from your own account? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Nez and Mr. Haas, for your response. Do we have any other questions for Mr. Platero on the process of project review before we hand it over to Dr. Yellowman's division?
So to answer the questions about what you do, we do fund the operation and maintenance of the electric utility along with the other utilities. That's a normal part of our cost structure. But that is maintaining the existing lines and operating the existing lines so that the existing customers can still receive their services. NTOA is a not-for-profit entity. All of our money that we get comes from our customers. So as we add new customers to the system, if they don't pay the cost to be added to the system, then our existing customers have to bear those costs. Now, whether I go out and borrow the money from a third party to put these things in place, or I get the money up front, at the end of the day, the customer is going to end up paying for it, just like any other utility organization. And if we can get the money up front to pay for it, then it relieves the burden on the existing customers and the new customers so that their costs of service can be cheaper in the long run. So that's how this is put together and formatted.
Thank you, Mr. Haas, for your response. Ashashat Daidos Kinde. Okay, we will then go ahead and go to action item B, Division of Community Development update for ARPA chapter projects. Dr. Yellowman from Division of Community Development, we'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Yeah, hey, can you hear me?
Good afternoon. Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I am way out near Torion Star Lake today, and able to get to a good hill here. Good afternoon to our council delegates and our colleagues on the line, and chapter officials and chapter staff. They're listening in. So good afternoon to everybody, and happy April. Just to add to the conversation, and listening to Tom or adding to Tom's responses, aside from the amendments that are being made, or taking into consideration the amendments, we are having to update information. So I think maybe to go back to Delegate Crotty's question about how things were vetted, or how do we know communication back from the chapters or DCD back to the chapters. So one thing we're trying to improve upon or help highlight is the 558 projects that were originally submitted by the chapters to DCD have all been put on the DCD webpage per delegate. So that's what was submitted. there are still chapters that we're encouraging to schedule an appointment. There's technical hours too that we have on our DCD webpage. Those technical hours are for the chapters to ask questions about technical assistance. But I also recommend that the chapters schedule time with Shayla. Shayla helps the chapters walk through the DCD portal and properly submit or verify any type of projects that they submitted. So how we were originally going about it was there was the proposed expenditure bill 1, which is 257, and that has 5 major categories: broadband, water, wastewater, electricity, bathroom, and housing. So those were the projects from the chapters that we had submitted to DOJ for eligibility review. So I think just to be careful when we say vetted, what we're asking is for DOJ to give us an eligibility review. And when we get the eligibility review, when you go to the 257 and you read through the appendix or you read through the exhibits, in the exhibits, you'll see that it'll say eligibility review, it'll have a number like 5.1 or 4.1. Those numbers are eligibility review, and they belong to a different category. So what we've been working on is updating all of the projects that the chapter submitted to have which projects were reviewed by DOJ and I guess given back one of those numbers. That way the chapters and delegates can say, oh, this power line project has been submitted. It came back, it was given a review by DOJ, and it's issued an eligibility number. What has not been issued to DOJ are some of the projects that we have not reached any type of expenditure for yet, like a warehouse. If you recall, one of the proposed expenditure plans was the expenditure plan 2 for the proposed $2 million to the chapters, and in there would have been some consideration for some of the projects at the chapters submission for them to submit for those projects. So some of those are like warehouses, garden projects, fencing projects, still equally important, but we have been focused on the 5 major infrastructure. So those are the ones that have been submitted. There were other projects that were submitted to DCD. Some of those were economic development projects. EED submitted those for DOJ eligibility review, and DOJ got their responses back from DOJ on those submissions. Those will be the ones that we update as well. In DOH, we sent, when we received, DCD received projects from the chapters regarding a senior center kitchen renovation or a senior center upgrade. We sent those projects to NDOH for their acknowledgement, and they sent those projects to DOJ for review. Those are projects that we can number per DOJ review or eligibility review, and number those for projects that have been sent to DOJ. There were some very few projects or chapters that submitted for a road project. But at this time, road projects are not are being reserved for the potential funds for the Build Back Better. So we've sent those still to NDOT for their review and consideration. So we are updating all of what the chapter submitted so that we have a determination, or there's a column in the DCD portal when you look up a delegate's projects, that there's an additional column as to what has been reviewed by DOJ and what has not been reviewed. So I hope that provides some clarification. The other is a lot of questions that we get back is, or a lot of questions we get is the DCD portal open? Yes, it is. But again, I ask that you make some time and let myself know or Shayla know. That way she can help walk you through the portal. There are instructions and there is a guideline in the ARPA portal webpage. That's all on the DCD webpage under ARPA, and it'll give you some of the areas that were being considered, and now there's these categories that Mr. Platero was talking about. Those are being updated or potentially being finalized by DOJ, and these are the eligibility categories that will be very helpful to everybody, so that everybody has a better understanding as to what is eligible, or what is really what is eligible, so you can understand those categories, or if you have questions. I know Mr. Platero and I, we've been discussing how to do orientations or how to do outreach on the descriptions of those categories. So that's something we're still discussing as to how we're going to go about outreach, maybe by agency, or maybe through video. So the mechanism to do outreach is still being discussed. So all in there. I don't know if there's any additional questions. The other thing that's really big is the support and staffing. So we did request for funds to hire potentially up to 56 positions, and they vary from planners and estimators to account specialists. So those are positions that I'm working with our IT department on doing some job fairs, and we're working with ASC to do office scanning, like where can we best place these potential hires, where might we have space, or where might we have a place at one of the chapters strategically available for other chapters to come and coordinate and communicate with. So those are some things that we're taking into consideration, and seeing what type of supplies that those new hires may need, or a regional setup, so to speak. What kind of equipment might they need? So those are some items that we're planning on. Those are things that need to happen, even though right now their amendments are happening and being made. We're still having to adjust to leadership. So I just want to make sure I'm respectful in how I describe the different types of timelines going on. At DCD, we still have to move forward with the PCQs and the positions. And then we're working with council and those amendments that are being made. So just making sure I'm clear on that. But I'll stop there, Melinda, and if there's any questions, I'm here on the line. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yellowman, for your presentation. Do we have any comments or questions? Do we have any comments or questions regarding Division of Community Development?
Melinda, this is Delegate Crotty. If I could ask, Dr. Yellowman, Yate Shada, thank you for joining the call. For the last item that you mentioned, the workforce and the positions that you have, do you have anything in writing that we could send out to the chapters in terms of like what space or what does that dynamic look like so that we could have those individuals be available locally for the chapters? What's your timeline in terms of, because I did hear PCQs and that can be a bit tedious, but how can the chapters understand what you're looking for? Is there a memo, or maybe you could just forward that to my office so that we could continue to have that conversation where we could house these individuals who are going to be funded under the ARPA to provide technical assistance? Thank you.
Dr. Yellowman?
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, PCQs, yeah, they're tedious and time consuming, but I am away from I have my several computers here, but if I'm not mistaken, we do have positions being advertised, and I want to double check that, but they're very close to being advertised. But our next step is to even do some job fairs or getting out the communication. And I think we have some booths that we're going to be advertising at. I think I'm scheduled to go to Diné College and set up a booth there. Some of this is done on weekends. We're recruiting internally for some staff to travel with me on Saturdays to Diné College and to you. I think there's some flea markets on the weekends. I guess desperate times call for desperate measures, but we're really putting together a recruiting team to go out and find people to work for us. When I get back to a place where I have better service, I'm pretty sure I sent a listing of ARPA positions that were listed under DCD to another chapter this week. So I want to make sure, but we're beginning the hiring phases. The other thing is we need to make sure that we have locations for these individuals in the event that we can get hired or we hire them, and our IT can provide the proper supplies and materials. Also, internally, we've been talking about how to rotate some of our staff because our new staff will need some type of training, but we have veteran staff who are more familiar with the procurement. That ties back into the ARPA office. The ARPA office is designed to be highly equipped with accounting and the individuals from the one-stop shop to help with the clearances, all of that in that central locations. And so we need to be able to tie into how to coordinate communications on some of these projects or any type of projects that need to be reviewed or need the assistance of the ARPA office. So there's a lot of coordination that we're still ironing out with Mr. Platero's office, so with the ARPA office. So I hope that provides some clarification. And Tom, I don't know if you have access to the EPM website, and if that can be brought up, that would be good. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yellowman, for your response. Do we have any other follow-up questions or comments at this time?
Melinda, I just want to add one thing.
Yes, go ahead.
So when you look at the BFS 31-21 and the entities that Mr. Platero was talking about earlier, there's the Navajo Nation government units, the non-certified chapters, and the submission process for that, and then the certified chapters, and then the Navajo Nation owned entities, and then external entities. I think it's really important that we're working with DOJ on this, because if a university or a church wanted to do something with within the delegate region area or within the chapters, with coordination with the chapters, that we really discuss how that mechanism gets ironed out, because in essence, if DCD is signing off on something, is DCD taking on the responsibility of a parochial or a church or an entity of that matter? So those are some things that we really need to clarify. That's more of a question probably to DOJ myself too. So I want to make sure when we say DCD signs off or a division signs off, like what is it that that entity or the chapter is taking on the responsibility for? So those are some of the things that we really need to clarify. So just want to put that out there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yellowman. Do we have any other follow-up questions or comments before we go into the next presentation?
Melinda?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Mr. Arvizo, this is James Spinelli from Cove. I have a question.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Benali.
Yes, Dr. Yellowman, you indicated that DOJ reviews these. My question is, some of these proposals have been written by and reviewed by technical people in certain areas. And as far as technical sufficiency, I would say that they are. My question is, how does DOJ say they have the technical background or the professional background to say a project is okay? If it's for legal sufficiency, then shouldn't all those have been addressed at the beginning of this legislation, to where if they needed to provide some guidelines, we could just readily follow those guidelines rather than have them say, okay. So I guess that's where my confusion lies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Benali. Dr. Yellowman?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Benali. That's a really good question. So I'm not sure if DOJ is on the line, but I hope I can answer this to the best of my ability. So, for example, if DCD submits the Appendix A for the bathroom addition, we did the verification or the assessments. We had to collect data and we had to collect information on 4,700 recipients is what we have now under our bathroom addition listing. And there's a lot of information that you put into the Appendix A. DOJ has taken on under the Fund Management Plan 4121 that they are keeping the nation in compliance of the fiscal recovery funds. So what they're doing is we submit the project, so DCD and a chapter, we're entities trying to submit a project or submitting the Appendix A. And the Appendix A is is what we need to do. It's our responsibility to make that sufficient. DOJ reviews that based on the eligible criteria of these federal funds. I hope that answers. So there's times where we had to go back and forth, and DOJ would say this is not sufficient, or this needs X information or Y information, and we have to submit that information. That's why I mentioned earlier, it's important to have some outreach and orientation to the chapters about what the Appendix A process is and the submission of doing those, so that the chapters themselves know, or any entity submitting, know what it is that DOJ is needing to deem that application sufficient for federal funds. The other thing to note is, and this is, DOJ really holds us to this, is the application process. There's windows for it, there's a timeline for it, and I believe there's a timeline in the new amendment, but also there's only 2 review opportunities for that application. So I submitted an application for 257. It came back to me. I had to make sure that I crossed my T's and dotted all my I's and make sure that I was sufficient in this application for these federal funds. So the responsibility is on us to do that, but DOJ reviews the application and deems them sufficient for the federal funds, or within that category we're submitting it for. So I hope that answers or provides some clarification. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more technical language from DOJ that will help elevate the response. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yellowman. Do we have a follow-up question, Mr. Benali?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Kayoko. Thank you for your response, Dr. Yellowman. I guess I kind of wanted an expansion on the latter part of my question. If this is for legal sufficiency, and why weren't there any guidelines for us to abide by? And right now we don't have those guidelines, and it seems like when we initially submitted some of the projects, those guidelines weren't available. And then now in the fourth quarter, we are sort of, not probably the third quarter, that we're finally getting exposed to these guidelines, and I guess that's where I have a concern. And it seems like we at the chapter are always trying to play catch up when all these things should have been forthcoming at the beginning. Dr. Yellowman, yeah.
Melinda, can I comment?
Yes, Dr. Yellowman, do you want to answer the question real quick? And then we'll go to Mr. Platero.
Okay. The Appendix A, that is in BFS 31-21. So we've been putting that in our presentations to the chapters and encouraging the chapters to read those. The fund management is the 41-21, and the BFS is the application process. So that was signed into law, I guess, last year. But we are working with the APRA office on providing those trainings. That's a good question, Mr. Benali, because I get a lot of heat because I didn't review a school. But respectfully speaking, I work with the chapters, So when we tell the chapters, here you read this BFS 31-21, that's why I'm saying there's other entities out there. So if I proceed with a orientation to the chapters, does that make me responsible for churches and schools and universities? It's really complex. So I'm not trying to vent or anything, but I'm just saying, yes, the information needs to get out to the chapters. I can take responsibility for that, but you end up just swallowing all of those other entities that need that information as well. So that's where the coordination comes in with the APRA office. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess you make that clarification so I can, that kind of satisfies my question. So, yeah, Dr. Yellman.
Thank you, Mr. Benali. Dr. Yellman. Mr. Platero?
Melinda, everybody on the call, one of the things that we really need to acknowledge is that when basically the fund management or the ARPA funds, fiscal recovery funds, were established under CJY 4121, when council enacted it, it gave that authority to budget and finance to create the process. The process, the policy that governed how these funds are made were all legislative in nature. The president signed off on CJY 4121 because it was a council resolution. Now, the process that's supposed to be followed, which are the Exhibit 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, those were established from council's delegation to budget and finance to create. So the executive branch wasn't involved in that process. That was a legislative decision and a legislative enacted process that was approved. We do have questions also on the technical support, the technical aspects of the proposals. What I can let you guys know is, and to let Dr. Yellman know, is that if there are others that are under Exhibit 1, Exhibit 4, and Exhibit 5, which the government units, the Navajo Nation-owned entities, the external entities, our office doesn't have a problem signing on those ones for, like they said, the church, the school, all of those ones that aren't chapter. The chapter is the only one that's specific to community development signing. We have had some forwarded to us, and we've coordinated those, and those have included health ones, and those have included colleges. We are submitting those ones, so we have no issue at helping with that. We're getting more staff here, and they're willing to work with people to get those resolved, and so we're willing to help do those things. But
Thank you, Mr. Platero. Follow-up comment. Do we have any other response, comments, or questions? Chapters, you just need to press *6 to unmute.
Good afternoon. This is Lorraine. I'm calling from Cove Chapter.
Yes, go ahead, Lorraine.
This question is to Pearl Yellowman. We did submit a proposal for power line and also water line. How soon is it going to be forward to Ntua or OEH? And then when we submit our proposals through the portal, does that mean that we go through the Exhibit 3 all over again to determine our eligibility? And the last question, Mr. Patero and the CJY 4122, there's 3 areas. There's the first section that says including assistance to the household. And if you look at your expenditure category, 3.1 point 12, it says housing. Does that mean that we can do our housing housing assessment and apply for housing funds for our community? If that's to Mr. Patero too.
Thank you, Lorraine. We'll start with Dr. Yellowman for the response, and then we'll go to Mr. Platero. Dr. Yellowman? Okay, while we await Dr. Yellowman to get back on the call, I believe her call was dropped. Mr. Platero?
Melinda, everybody else on the call, I believe housing has already been established as an eligible project. If you look back under 25721, that's how it was all grouped together. Now, what you have to do is now, since it's being taken apart, then when the chapter is going to do those ones, if it's on that list, then it should be okay. But if it's not on that list, then you have to go back in and get the approval through the review process. So it's been established that housing is an eligible project, I believe, under CJY 41-50, the resolution that's sitting before council now. So that it has been established that it can do that. So a lot of these, we actually have to go through the process and kind of replicate it. So what's happening is, there was a blanket authorization that was done through CJY 5721, but now you're breaking those ones up into 24. So they're going to have to go back through the process, but they have to be written in a fashion similar to what was in the approval that was in the other one. If you look at the legislation, you can see all of the plans that were written in there. I would just follow that format and just replicate it as closely as you can to it, because you know that already went through the approval process.
Melinda, this is Mr. Haas. I might be able to answer a few of her questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Platero. And really quick, I'm sorry, Mr. Haas, hold on one second. Do we have Dr. Yellowman back on the call yet? Okay, go ahead, Mr. Haas.
Thank you. On the question, you had two questions. You had a question about a power line under Cove that was put under the portal, and then you had some questions regarding water lines. On the power line that was put under the portal for the Cove, there wasn't specific enough information to get the project fully vetted, but in the original legislation, we had enough dollars set aside to be able to utilize and do the project. On the water line circumstances, most of the water lines were SDS type projects that are underneath the IHS funded programs. And later in my presentation, I'll kind of show you how to walk through some of those issues. And as Tom said before, if the new legislation is going to decouple all the projects from the original legislation, then we're going to have to refill out the paperwork on an individual category basis for each one of the delegates' regions and go back through the process with the Department of Justice. And as said earlier, the Department of Justice is really looking to see, does it meet the requirements of the federal government so that these funds can be applied to that specific project. And that's really what they're looking to do. But when the original legislation was written, it was done very large with lots of projects. As Dr. Yeoman mentioned before, there was over 4,700 bathrooms that needed to be looked at. There was more than 4,000 power lines that needed to be fully found to be feasible and vetted through the process. So when we did it in a category classification, which would allow us the time to do the feasibility on a project by project basis and not have to go back through the process on a project by project basis. So I hope that helps. I think that some of the things that, if I get an opportunity to walk through some of the information that was prepared, I hope it will help fill in some of the blanks.
Thank you, Mr. Haas. Lorraine from co-chapter, we did take note of your other two questions for Dr. Yellowman. We'll be sure to follow up with you on those questions, Ishjan. Do we have any other comments or questions before we go to NTUA? I do believe Dr. Yellowman has been unable to get back on the call so far, so we'll go ahead and go to the NTUA presentation as well as Indian Health Service. I do believe Mr. McDonald is on the line from IHS, and of course we do have Mr. Haas as well. So the NTUA presentation is a 3-component presentation on water projects updates, broadband projects updates, as well as electricity. So we'll go ahead and have NTUA go ahead and provide their presentation at this time.
Melinda, would Brandon in my office be able to share the screen so he could put some things up so it'd be easier for folks to be able to follow the conversation?
Yes, go ahead, Brandon.
Okay. Mr. Haas, which tab did you want to start on?
Why don't we just start in the beginning, and we're going to go through it kind of quickly, but I think it will be helpful for folks to know this information is available to them. So all the council delegates got booklets and got emails sent out several times, and we've asked them to please share this information with the chapters, because it's extremely important that you have some of this information. And I also believe that Tom has been able to put it on his website. It's a tremendous amount of information, but in the beginning of the booklet, it starts out with basically tries to give each one of the delegate based on their region. It talks about what was put into Pearl, Dr. Yellowman's ARPA portal, and it tries to determine, okay, how many submissions were made from each delegate region. So in delegate Amber Crotty's region, there was 32 submissions, $38,465,850. It talks about where and what was specifically funded on a project-specific basis. Now, in her particular region, there was no project specifics in 025721. The Cove Electric project wasn't considered project specific because it wasn't fully vetted. So it falls into a place called a pool-based or needs-based, or 9 of her projects of the 32 fall into that category class. And that allows us to do the feasibility study, correct any issues related to budgets, and be able to fund it through that process. 3 of the 32 projects that were submitted were already part of a previous legislation, 020921. And then 2 of the projects are already on the IHS SDS projects, which are fully funded now, which we'll get to that. And the reason they're not on the current list is, as I said, for the very first time in the history, IHS's SDS projects have all been fully funded. And they've been funded over $150 million above the funding mechanism, or the height of the funding, so that other projects could get submitted in there. There's 5 projects in her submissions that are not currently on the SDS list, but are most probably eligible to be on the SDS list. Now, in here it says 0 defunding CARES projects that were specific, but there are some electric and others that actually are on her list. Again, this was created a little bit earlier. There was nothing from the Sahasn or the UFFB. And then there was 13 projects that they still needed to have funding sources determined, and there are different eligibilities. So each delegate had a snapshot of kind of project-specific information. And then if Brandon, if you go to the next, just go to the very next page, then you'll actually see the detail related to all the submittal projects for Amber Crotty that were on the ARPA portal and where those projects could be potentially funded from. Okay, each delegate has this representation utilizing the ARPA portal and Dr. Yellowman's group that was mentioned before. Now, Brandon, if you just, every delegate has one of these. So Brandon, if you just go to the next section, please. And what's important here is we want folks to be able to share this information with you. And then what we did is we broke down the information into the actual chapter. So in the Cove chapter, there was a water line project for $300,000. And then there was a second project for $1 million. We could not specifically find those in the current IHS listing. So we need to get a little bit more information, but those would be most likely eligible for a future IHS SDS project funding. Then I just wanted to go to number 6, where there was $1 million requested for a chapter power line extension. There was money in the original legislation to be able to build this project, but we didn't have enough details on the project and didn't have the whole vetting of the project to go through the feasibility and get the right of way. NTUA doesn't enter and say that it has a project specific item until it's made a determination that the project is feasible and that we've been able to acquire the right of way, which takes a long period of time to be able to do. But you can see how it was laid out and where the potential funding sources are for Delegate Crotty. Each delegate has a similar representation sheet in this listing. Again, this is available online, and it's also the delegates have it. Brandon, so if you would just keep on going. Okay, so after going through each one of the delegates' listings and the processes, as we went through this, Brandon, you're going to need to go back. I believe you're okay. All right. There should be an overall heading on the electric. There should be a summary page. Okay, well, that's fine. We'll get through this. On a secondary page, what we did on the legislation is this particular legislation, again, is Amber Crotty. It gives you more detail. It gives you the breakdown of potential electric projects. It gives you the breakdown of broadband projects that are laid out here. And it also talks about, in general, the Navajo Nation was taking on the responsibility to build the emergency 911 system and do the real rural addressing for all of the Navajo Nation. So there was a request in here on that. They asked for $50 million to do that. And then they also needed money to improve their cybersecurity. And then they needed a certain amount of money to do upgrades in the police area. So if you want to scroll down this sheet a little bit, this just kind of gives you an identification of different projects that were laid out in these areas and where we were attempting to be able to provide the resources to help through the process. Okay. Brandon, you want to go to the next page, please? Okay. So we're now going to talk about water in general. That original information was focusing on the ARPA portal and what was in the legislations that would help fund the different things that people ask for in a portal. Now, if we talk about just on the water side of the ARPA portal or the DCD portal, they're the same portal. This gives you a breakdown of where projects are and what could be included and not included. And as you see this breakdown, there's really just one ineligible area, at least under the ARPA funding, which was really irrigation and livestock projects, which accounted for about $9.3 million. Again, this was from the whole portal's request. If you go to the next slide, okay, Brandon, there should be the 2 points in between. There you go. Thank you. There you go, right there. So what we wanted to explain in here is the DCD portal for the chapter priorities and the way it was laid out. There was approximately $300 million requested in 93 projects that were water or wastewater projects. And what this shows is there's a little bit of overlap from the portal into legislation 025721. And then there was a little bit of overlap in the defunded, the CARES and the Sahasan and the UUSB. But the reality of the matter is there's 367 current projects under the IHS SDS project list, totaling $543 million. All of those projects for the very first time in history, the United States government has fully funded those projects. So if you go to the next picture, please, you're going to see that we can push most of the projects.
I'm just listening to his presentation. Sure. Thanks, man.
Okay, so you basically, when you look at this, out of the 93 projects, 87 of them can be put in or either on the current listing or could be on the future listing for IHS projects. There's only 6 projects with the irrigation and livestock that aren't funded in those dollars. So the idea was, let's use the IHS funded funding process and not utilize the process for the ARPA dollars to fund these projects, which is we're trying to utilize and save that money for the benefit of the Navajo people. You can also see that the United States federal government funded $675 million, $135 million per year for the next 5 years for IHS SDS projects. The current list only has $543 million. So there's an additional $132 million available under that current listing, that projects that are currently not identified on the current SDS list has an opportunity to fall into that $132 million bucket. Again, the livestock and the irrigation projects are not something that IHS can fund, nor something that is currently allowable under ARPA funding. If you go to the next slide, okay, so that's the reason we did this. Now, on these particular slides, when we put together the water wastewater projects, understanding that IHS is going to meet most of all the needs for fully funded projects, we actually focused on projects that are not allowed to be underneath the IHS funding, that can provide additional capacity, additional resources, and can help rebuild part of the water distribution systems so that those costs will not be borne by the N2A water customers in the long run. And again, the reason we focused on doing this is because the other needs can be met through the IHS SDS process. And we were requested to identify $300 million worth of projects. And we did that also with the Navajo Nation Department of Water Resources. So we did about $250 million worth of identification, and the Navajo Nation Department of Water Resources, Jason's area, did about $50 million. So if you look at the very first piece where it says 511 drinking water transmission and distribution, when it talks about project description, it says water transmission and distribution. that would be the Navajo Nation Department of Water Resources. There were 7 projects that were identified. So anywhere you see NNDWR, that's the nation's projects list to bring additional capacity and equipment and services online for the benefit of Navajo people. The items below that, 5.1 and continuing down, are the projects that we kind of identified through the process as NTA projects. Again, as some of this was developed earlier on. A lot of the rules and regulations have changed over time a little bit, and the fully funding of IHS was occurring during this process, so we had to make changes to what we were proposing in real time. Now, if you go to the next slide, please, Brandon. That's the summary slide of water wastewater projects. Okay, and then the next slide talks about the actual category classes of projects, and it talks about basically where some of the funding sources are and how many projects are covered under the total amount of the $300 million of request in projects and the budgeted amount for the request, which is the $375 million. And it's a total of 87 projects that, again, we believe the best position and the best place to have the funding come from is IHS, so that the ARPA dollars can go on and maximize the benefit on behalf of the Navajo people in the long run. So if you go to the next slide. Okay. Thank you. Thanks. So this talks about the actual legislation. It gives the chapter name and the delegate's name and the amounts. And if you could just keep sliding on down, because there's a whole bunch of slides here. The next ones are, here's your IHS SDS listing. This page right here is, I refer to it as a summary page. Talks about the actual project, the size of the project off the portal, and the delegate's name. Does that for each delegate. If you keep going down the list, it gets you much more useful and better information. Again, because this talks about what was just submitted through the portal. And then it talks about the second part is our projects that were on the portal that we believe could fit into a future IHS SDS list, which IHS and us can help you get through the process to get these specific projects funded through those listings. We tried to make sure we took out as much duplication as we could through the process. And in some cases, there wasn't enough information for us to come up with a perfect solution. So the whole group did the best we could. And this was a very large group effort between the Navajo Nation departments, some outside consulting firms, and NTA and the FRF office. So if you keep sliding down, we give us specifics of what water projects that were asked for in the portal that were part of the defunded CARES and who the delegate is. And then it talks about projects that were under a potential legislation 020921. And then it talks about ineligible requests from 025721 projects that are outside of the ARPA funding lines based on the IRS rulings with the Department of Justice. So again, it gives you a lot of good information if you keep sliding down. This talks about the current legislation, the actual project listing, keep going down. And again, it gives you what projects were listed in the delegates region. Again, on these particular projects, you'll see there's a large amount of nationwide projects because, again, we're not able to vet and do feasibility studies on more than 10,000 projects. We didn't have the funding, we didn't have the time to actually go through them, but we knew that a lot of these projects were on your request list and there were projects that could move forward. So I wanted to make sure we had a placeholder in there so that as your projects were found to be feasible, they could be funded. If you could slide down. Okay. And then this gives a current listing of the water projects that were on your portal list again, that are on our listing by delegate, by name. Okay. If you could keep going. If you keep going down, please. I want to keep going. It's just the same listing. Okay. This is a very, very important piece of information, and I would strongly recommend that all the delegates make sure the chapter's representative gets this. This is the complete listing for fiscal year 2022 of all the IHS SDS projects that are funded, fully funded from IHS over the next 5 years. There's 349 projects totaling over $543 million of work. And this is the summary page. If you just keep going down, please, Brandon. This is really important. If you just stop here, Brandon, these are the individual projects that were listed in the categories above, and they're brought down. And what's real important here is on the left side, if you just look at the Shiprock water line, okay, it's got a number NM 28341-0702. That is the IHS number. So if a delegate or a chapter wants to understand where that project is in the process, they can contact the IHS representative and give them that number, and they can be told where they're at in the process, meaning, are you in design, feasibility, right away, those type of things. All of these projects have received funding from the United States Congress over the next 5 years, as we talked about. So these are not part of the legislation because these are all funded separately. And then, as I mentioned before, there's over $100 million of SDS dollars out there that can be applied for other projects that can be deemed eligible over the next 5 years. So this is a real important list. What also needs to happen on this list is that some of this information needs to be updated, because on the Shiprock water line, that project is talking about providing services to 3 homes. There may be more homes, or some of the homes that were originally identified may need to be updated. So it is important that we do get engagement and involvement to help IHS get these projects built and to make sure that we have the current costs and that we also have the right information so that we don't leave potential customers behind when we go to construct these type of projects. But if you go all the way down to the bottom of this list, I don't believe this number is totaled, but if you keep going all the way down, please, again, it shows each delegate and shows the specifics. But I believe for the $543 million, I believe that there's going to be more than 20,000 water services to homes if you added up all those numbers through the process. It also has identified in there for some folks that have failed septic systems. And how do we get that list to be more accurate? Because I know there's a lot of systems out there with problems. But we can help you through the process to help get these identified. IHS can help you through the process. And we need to do this as a team and as a community so that we can make sure that IHS is successful and, most importantly, gets the services to the Navajo people that desperately need those services. So that's a really important piece of the IHS SDS project funding list. These projects are funded no matter what happens to legislation 025721. And this is really important information for all the districts to be able to have and be able to utilize. If you would keep going down, please. Okay. Okay. Now, this happens to be, again, more information on what was in some legislation and what projects there are that are not part of the SDS listing. Okay, keep going, Brandon. Okay, keep going, please. Okay, on this particular one, what we did is we created an overall summary page on a delegate by delegate person so that you could see how many water projects are funded and where the sources for funding are. And then also, if it's a future funding source, like in this case, the $2,590,000, we're pointing it out so we can help you get through the process to get that to no longer be a future, but to get it onto the current IHS SDS listing. And we have a listing for every single delegate here on the water side to help be able to get these projects to be built. So Brandon, you want to just go through this whole section here to the bottom? Okay, just keep going because it's a breakout page per delegate, and then at the back of the page it keeps providing additional information of breakdowns on a delegate by delegate and a chapter by chapter area. Okay. Okay, Brandon, you want to go to the next section then? Okay. So now we're moving on to, you can see how the water was put together. Again, we were trying to be mindful to best utilize the dollars to help not create duplication in funding sources, but also to try to keep the long-term overall cost to the actual end users as economic as possible. Now, in the original broadband, which was a middle mile, last mile solution through the process, there was $208 million designated in the original legislation for these categories. You can see the breakout of there was about $32 million on project-specific projects for last mile, and there was about $68 million for middle mile projects. There was basically a breakdown between last mile and middle mile of 20 million and 40 and 25 million that were for non-NQA specific projects. In other words, it could be for Sacred Wind, it could be for Frontier, it could be for others. We didn't have the information to determine which projects could move forward. The idea was to be able to work directly with the organizations and the communities and the NNTRC to determine what's the best way to utilize those dollars. But there was dollars set aside so that communities would be able to get access to the dollars and have infrastructure built. As mentioned earlier, the Navajo Nation needed $50 million designated out of broadband for rural addressing. And it's more than just rural addressing, it was also an emergency 911 system. You have to get the rural addressing in place so you can overlay that on the emergency 911, but the $50 million was designed to do all of that. There was $5 million for the police and fire department to upgrade their communications equipment so that they would be able to utilize the new emergency 911 system and be able to respond and better find people when they're distressed. And then there was an $8 million request for the Navajo Nation cybersecurity to be able to protect all the information that the Navajo Nation has. And a lot of those areas also, the Navajo Nation provides the IT services to the chapters, so it rolls down to be able to protect your information at those levels too. So that's what the $208 million worth of broadband projects were composed of at a very high level. If you scroll down, Brandon, you can scroll down, Brandon, please. Okay. What this is this is a breakdown of specific projects by a specific delegate in a state, in a region. And on this particular page, this talks about the last mile delivery. So this is a way to broadcast a signal so that homes in the area could receive services. In addition to this, we had fiber to home in certain areas so that we could increase the capacity and the speed and the distance that the wireless product could travel so that people could get an upgraded service on the wireless as you take more and more people off the wireless system and put them on a fiber system, it makes the wireless system a much faster system. This whole project comprises of 24 new broadcast stations, 22 towers. So these were targeted for people who had service that was poor, and it was targeted for people who had no service at all. And again, there's 22 new towers and broadcast stations to basically take care of unserved areas. And then there was 2 places that were enhancements that would increase the speed and capability and would help the underserved area become classified as a broadband served area. So this is kind of the layout on the project specific basis of areas that were identified through the process. We also identified customer premise equipment so that customers could get the equipment and would be able to reduce their monthly bill by about $10 a month or $120 a year, because they wouldn't have to pay for the equipment through the process. And then there was a category class in the next section. If you want to go to the middle mile section, the middle mile section basically talks about building fiber optics for long haul distances to get capacity around the nation, and it also talks about towers. There was a total of 22 brand new towers in this. You can see where they're kind of laid out. And then there was one other large thing. We were talking about an electronics upgrade to upgrade the backbone, because you get more and more users on the system, and we don't want the system to slow down for the existing users. So we needed to upgrade the backbone to handle the additional users and capacity from 100 gigabyte to 400 gigabyte. And we're one of the only carriers on the nation that has fiber optic connected to the internet grid in all the way to Albuquerque, to Denver, and to Phoenix. And the reason we've done it this way is because the internet does fail at major parts or major hubs at times, or points of connection or points of presence. And we wanted to make sure that the system was reliable and redundant so people could have a high quality service and be able to stay online even when some of the bigger cities had problems. So if you just keep going down the list, that this is an example of the broadband. The last mile and the middle mile for other carriers was designated to be 25 million and 20 million. We talked about some sample projects in here, but we did not vet the projects because these monies would be going to non-NTA providers. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll see we don't have any specifics located in there. There is a slide, I think you passed it, that talked about some of the chapters requesting stuff, but we would have to work with their individual providers to be able to know if they can actually provide the service or not. And then the last 3 slides just talk about what I've already described, the rural 911 and rural addressing for $50 million, the $5 million for public safety for the police and fire department to have the proper electronics in their cars to be able to utilize the new system. And the last $8 million is for the cybersecurity so that the Navajo Nation's people's sensitive information and equipment can be secured.
Mr. Haas, I'm sorry, this is Melinda. Bless you, whoever was coughing, but we're gonna have to mute callers who are gonna make noise. Apologies, Mr. Haas, go ahead.
No problem, thank you. So that just gives you a brief overview of the broadband section. If we could move on to the electric section. Okay. Well, hold on, go back a slide. There you go. So this is actually the slide I was referring to before. These are requests that came through the ARPA portal, or maybe it's better called the DCD portal. These were requests that came through that were identified as non-NTUA type providers. We put them on the list because those would be the first areas that we would ask the outside vendors to vet on behalf of these individuals if we were allowed to go through the process. And the reason we were asked, this isn't something N2A wanted to do, but N2A was asked to be able to do this is because we have the technical capability and expertise to do the analysis on the technology to ensure that it will meet the IRS standards required for the ARPA dollars to be utilized. And they have quite a high standard list that needs to be gone through to make sure it's vetted. And the Department of Justice didn't feel they had the in-house technical expertise to be able to go on a project by project basis to understand whether it would meet the IRS standards or not. So we were asked to provide that additional support, and we were happy to be able to do that for folks. So if you want to go on now, that's really the broadband original legislation presentation. I'm going to talk about the water. I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about the electric. Brandon, somehow we missed the electric. And then I'll go through the other ones real quick. And then I want to be able to talk about how the current legislation, amended legislation rolls into this. So under the electric, we had down $160 million to connect up 3,977 customers. And then we identified 800 solar units for $40 million for a total of $200 million. If you go to the next slide, Decker, we didn't determine who's getting what in this particular case because in NTUA, we don't determine it until we actually get through the right-of-way process. So we try to get all the projects identified. We do a feasibility study. We start the right-of-way process. There's a lot of things happening in the right-of-way process that we don't have control over, but we're able to move it on. In addition to this, we did have funding in here for Continental Divide, Amos Mountain, APS, City of Farmington, and the City of Gallup, if they were to feed Navajo Nation homes that reside in their area. So we had dollars set aside for those groups that we do sub-grant recipients with. We had a very successful program with the CARES Act funding. We were able to connect up over I think it was 57 homes with Amos Mountain, APS, and Continental Divide in a 4-month period of time. We've already pre-funded getting some homes connected under defunded CARES. So we already have a very good relationships with those utilities. And we are very proud of that partnership in helping those folks move forward. So the breakdown of the actual $160 million was $95 million for the home connections. We provided money in there for basically doing house wiring because most of the homeowners can't afford to do the house wiring. And in some cases, even if their houses are wired, they can't afford to pay for the inspections and the minor repairs. So we had $24 million set aside for that. We also had $40 million set aside for system capacity upgrades. And we have to build new substations. We have to put in additional equipment to make when we add on to the system, when you get above a certain distance, the system won't work anymore. The voltage gets brought down and the existing customer systems don't work. So you basically have to rebuild, and not really rebuild is the wrong word, but you have to put in additional capacity to feed the additional customers that are coming online. And as you put in that additional capacity, you have to also work on trying to get redundancy because now you're going into other areas. So you don't want to have lines that are 200 miles long. You want to keep those lines shorter so that all the people aren't affected when a customer in the middle of the line has an outage. So you have to be able to do that to just provide the quality of service that the Navajo people deserve through that process. So that's where those dollars come from. If you scroll down a little bit, there you go. We actually have a bunch of projects that were fully vetted. These are community projects that NQA has been working on. There's a few projects in here that Continental and others had talked about, but these projects were projects we had rights of way and were working on, and we've already identified those projects. You scroll all the way down, out of the almost 4,000 projects there's 625 that we already know could be built and have engineering and feasibility and have moved along in the process. The next group of projects that are categorized or listed in here are projects that came off of the DCD portal. These projects, again, we don't have all the information we need. Sometimes we don't have all the customer counts. We don't have the length of lines and some of the cost estimates, but we did provide dollars even when they were non-NQA projects, like I said, Hamus Mountain or Continental Divide or others, so that even people that are non-NQA customers would be able to get services through their local provider through the process. And we didn't put a cap on how much of the dollars could go to those other agencies or our sister utilities, just because we didn't want to have a restriction. We want to try to help as many people as possible. And it's really about having enough time to get these projects built. There is a timeline that if you don't get them built by, you lose the funding. So we really need to work with everybody to expend these dollars as soon as possible and help as many people as possible, as fast as possible through the process. And then this is a list of projects. Now, again, in this particular listing, it talks about electric lines that are being built out. It talks about certain substations, reclosers, protective devices, so things can be extended out across those. And they're really trying to be built in. The idea behind this was to remove out anything that wasn't necessarily needed to be able to help those particular customers that ask for new services to be brought online. That's what the engineers were asked to do through the process. So you can see there was a bunch of dollars for Red Valley, which is part of the Cove project. Even though we didn't say it was completely feasible right now, we do know that there's system improvements that need to be put in place to raise the capacity, raise the voltage, and raise the ability to provide services to those customers. If you just would scroll past this then, going through that, we're just going to be going into the solar projects. On the solar projects, again, we're taking applications, but we did not identify all the customers. Our hope or goal is to get a certain amount of customers per delegate region. The idea was to get 30 customers per delegate region and then have some additional customers available for veterans, which is 80. So you had a total of 800. I will tell you that in certain areas, there isn't the demand for the solar as it is in other places. So there is some flexibility for us. The typical solar unit is about $50,000 totally installed, which includes the house wiring and includes basically a battery backup. It includes a pumper motor for the cistern type units. It includes a refrigerator, the solar units, again, as you kind of go through the process. That is the overall of what was in the original legislation. Would you scroll down to the bottom there for me? If you can just keep going to the, if you can go to the bathroom additions, I think was the next piece real quick. Inside the original legislation, there was bathroom additions. There was funding for 1,000 bathroom additions. The bathroom additions are not just bathrooms. They include a water source. They include a wastewater source. They include internal plumbing, the bathroom, a hot water system, and electrical supply. So it is a large system that folks are getting through the process. We had more than 4,000 requests, and the dollars that were set aside for would be able to do at least 1,000 units. And this was in partnership with DCD and in partnership with NECA to be able to get the units installed and put in place. Go to the next slide grouping real quick. Okay, and this is the specific criteria that we look at as part of the feasibility study as we go through the bathrooms to qualify what type of service they get and what they needed and how we're able to do the feasibility and vet those out. There's more than a total of 10,000 projects that needed to go through all the feasibility. Again, we didn't get through all of them. We've gotten through as many as we can. We're continuing to self-fund those projects to get them evaluated to find out if they're constructible or not. And then I think there was one more tab, Brandon, after the bathroom additions.
After bathroom additions was hardship.
There was a after bathroom additions, there was housing, which I may not have that housing slide. But there was money, right? There was money in there for community housing to take care of some of the housing needs for the Navajo people. It wasn't enough. It was not as much money as needed nearly. It was $50 million for part of the, as it's kind of laid out here. It was $40 million distributed amongst 110 chapters for an actual building, and then there was $10 million for renovations and removals for $50 million. And if you go to the next slide, there's a little bit more. Keep going. Keep going, Brandon. Okay. Okay. One more slide. One more slide. Okay, so this is just a general information on it. Again, this wasn't N2A specific, but because I was going through what was embodied in the total legislation, I wanted to try to be as thorough as possible. Now, these projects went through the Navajo Nation's Department of Justice's process to be able to be shown that these type of projects would qualify for the ARPA dollars as long as they were installed properly and bid out in a proper manner and awarded in a proper manner. So that's what was in the original legislation. The new amendment to the legislation basically takes all these categories, removes all the dollars from all these projects and all these categories, and puts it into a delegate region. And each delegate region has about $41 million in it. And what it does is it goes back and it gives the delegate, along with the chapters, the responsibility to be able to identify what projects they'd like to move forward with, and then to have to go through the process to get those projects vetted and select the vendors and to go through the funding process to be able to get these in place and move forward. And that process is somewhat of a daunting process. In the original or the amended legislation, from my understanding, again, it hasn't been completely printed out and stuff. It did say that, you know, if a chapter so choose to, they wanted to do a power line chapter with a power line projects per se with N2A, that they could utilize their money to do that. But it still has to go back through the Department of Justice process. And from my understanding, it would still have to not only go through what Tom described earlier, but after the Tom's section, it would have to actually go to a contract format through the Navajo Nation. Now, N2A is standing by to help as many folks as they would like to if this legislation passes. But I do just want to make mention that, you know, the Defunded CARES Act legislation was passed over 9 months ago, and there was only 7 category classes of contracts and sub-grant recipient agreements. And as of today, as of earlier this week, N2A got its first funding on 6 of those categories. So 1 is still outstanding. So the process to be able to get through all of the red tape, if you want to call it that, or all the things that you need to do to be able to get to a place where you can start to construct, is a difficult task to get through those processes. Again, if you do decide to move forward with this and you do decide that you'd like to do something with N2A, you know, we'll do our best to help you through the process. But there's going to be quite a rush of folks trying to get things done through the process. And, you know, my reservation is we've already lost one construction season, it looks like we're going to lose another construction season. So it's going to be difficult to get everything built the way people want to get it built in the timelines that are available to us. But we stand ready, and I know that the Navajo Nation partners of mine stand ready to assist and try to get as much done to benefit the Navajo people as possible. I hope this answers your questions, and if you have any questions for me, please let me know.
Thank you, Mr. Haas, for your presentation. Do we have any questions or comments regarding NTUA's presentation? Lorraine from Cove Chapter, are you still on the line? Okay, thank you everyone again for joining the call this afternoon. Do we have any questions or comments regarding this discussion for NTUA Division of Community Development and or the FRF office?
Melinda Shadesa, this is Delegate Crotty with the question.
Oh, go ahead, Delegate Crotty.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Haas, for providing this overview to our chapters and is being recorded for individuals who were not able to join this live call. When going back to the electricity projects, so in reviewing the projects, there is a lot of capacity or systems projects for N2A. At what point, because what I'm looking at is the amount of money that is in the original legislation for the to be determined. So it's interesting that there's a place for these projects as they're to be determined to get funding, but when is that listing going to be provided so that we can cross-reference that with what chapters submitted when they did their community assessments on who needs electricity in our districts? Thank you.
Well, great, thanks. So two things. So we tried to do the very best we could. As I said, there's just on the electric side, there's more than 5,000 projects when you include the solar in there. So we tried to do our best to have placeholders. We didn't intend to dictate where everything was going to be done. So as an example, when we looked at the Cove chapter that was on one of your listings, we had familiarity with that project. So we did add in, here's the things we would need to do to the system if that project was actually built. So we had some of that information, but we would need to sit down and go through the process with your chapter to clearly identify the candidates that they want to get connected with that project and to do the full design. So again, we put in placeholders. So when you saw the to be determined dollars, those were basically placeholders for projects just like that, where we can come back and say, okay, and we thought that they wanted 20 people, they want 25. Here's what it's going to take to be able to do that for them. That would come out of the to be determined information, and then the whatever capacity that needed to be created so that those customers be connected would come out of those capacity dollars in those regions. So that's why there was not a lot of definition. We are not going to be able to get to the level of definition that you want until the chapters and N2A sit down and go through those determinations. There was only 640 homes out of the almost 4,000 homes that we've already done that with. So if you looked at, if Brandon can go back to the electric list, I can show you we did determine these 640 are feasible and where they are. Okay, but it still leaves over 3,000 customers that we have funding in that we want to meet on a chapter by chapter basis and do the full design, determine what needs to be added capacity wise or not, to connect those folks up. Not every project does require additional capacity to connect folks. So this listing that's in front of you, that's on the screen, shows the 640. Unfortunately, the projects that your chapter identified are not on this list right now. So we need to, as part of our Monday meetings with you, we need to make that determination and understand it, because a lot of the, when we go through chapter type processes, the chapter's in a better position than N2A to understand where their constituents are, and they can identify them to us. We can do the design to be able to get the services to them, and then come back with the costs to be able to connect them and a timeline to be able to do so. Because the right-of-way on these longer lead items, the right-of-way is taking 1.5 to 2 years to get through the process for just the right-of-way on the projects that are more than a mile long. So again, you know, we haven't received any of the dollars, we haven't received any of the stuff, so I don't have the physical capability to get through all 10,000 projects right now. We're trying to vet as many as possible and go through those processes. And you've done a wonderful help of your chapter by having regular meetings with us, because, you know, by doing that, and I would recommend as many delegates as possible to do that, it helps us understand what the community needs and fill in those to be determined numbers much quicker through the process.
Thank you, Mr. Haas, for your response. Do we have any other follow-up questions or comments?
Melinda, this is Tom.
Oh, go ahead, Mr. Platero.
Are there any questions for FRF? I need to get off this call. I apologize.
Are there any further questions for Mr. Platero on the project review process? Okay. Shadi, Delegate Crotty, I believe that concludes the presentations from NTUA, the FRF office, as well as Division of Community Development. We'll go ahead and hand it over to you for any other closing comments or questions. Delegate Crotty?
Oh, yeah.
I'm out.
They just think, Mr. Patero, you're not muted. Just thank you for all the presenters to have this comprehensive conversation on the status of your chapter projects that were in the ARPA portal, understanding the dynamic of what is being proposed to be funded, how those determinations were vetted by the technical team, and also the process that is required for the Navajo Nation Department of Justice eligibility review. So what the intent of this meeting and for the delegates on the line is to understand what additional support the chapters will need to assist in either processing or requesting your current projects to be reviewed by DOJ, or if in the instance there's an opportunity for to finalize some of the projects. That is the approach that we are taking. And so, you know, N2A is part of that. The Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Fund has been allocated funding from ARPA to provide that type of support. And as mentioned earlier by Dr. Yellowman, shot that they are hiring for additional support. Again, that's funded through the ARPA funding. And so I think that is also a conversation as chapters, as a Northern agency, that we should either, you know, have that informal discussion or really develop what will work best for Northern agency in terms of we have already in the past have done a lot of coordination like when it came to the emergency management plans or how we work together for the COVID relief. And now moving forward to make sure that we maximize the amount of benefit that these funds can provide for your community. So another area of future conversation is we really need to get in depth in the housing proposal and how we can expand or get more clarification on what's eligible through ARPA when it comes to housing needs to address multi families living in one home or community members who have a burnout and need a permanent home or major repairs. So that's going to continue to be future discussions. And the other area is other like government services. We haven't touched upon solid waste and how that's impacted the communities during COVID and how sometimes the challenge of disposing trash in Northern agency. And lastly, in terms of public safety, if there's any additional information or support that Northern agency would like to develop when it comes to public safety. As mentioned in this amendment, there's an allocation from the technical team for $50 million for rural addressing. A majority of our chapters have high percentage of completion when it comes to rural addressing. And so we would also need to have that conversation about what does that look like, or what is the timeline, and who is going to implement that rural addressing contract. And then lastly, again, Monday we'll just have a follow-up meeting with NTA on specific projects when it comes to District 12. But we're also going to include the conversation of natural gas. And so depending how that proposal is being put together, that might be an opportunity for the Northern chapters to understand how to maximize natural gas. And I would encourage chapter leadership delegates to contact NQA, and Monroe Keto has been very helpful when identifying with his technical team what are the possibilities of ARPA eligible broadband projects. In our discussions, we have possibly identified 2 additional towers that are not in the original legislation. And so that will definitely help increase broadband to our community. So Shadeja, that's my wrap up. And I just appreciate the help from the Office of the Speaker to coordinate this call and the logistics, and also for my colleagues who are being on this call, the presenters and the chapters, leadership, staff, and community members. When we're having these conversations, we're pivoting, and a pivot means we're changing a direction from a very centralized approach to decision making, and we're now opening up and understanding what projects and how they were added to the legislation, understanding the status of projects that were proposed by the chapters through the DCD portal. And this is also an opportunity for chapters to re-engage at a local level to make sure that through your community assessments, your projects and proposals are part of this relief fund, as we've all been exposed to COVID. And we come together in our bi-monthly calls with Northern Medical Center. We're hopeful that the virus is subsiding, but we also have learned a lot, and definitely know that if we can continue to make and be supported with local decision making, that works best for our region. So thank you, Shadeja, for coordinating the call, and I'm good with ending the call now and let me know how we can support Western Agency if they need additional information. And I'm not sure the status of the council session on Monday. So thank you, Shadeja.
Thank you, everyone, for getting on the call. We're going to go ahead and sign off now with those follow-up comments and in the discussion and the live stream. So thank you. Have a great weekend.